My name is Amelia, and I'm 28 now, looking back on the day I turned 18. That morning, my Ohio home buzzed with birthday balloons and the smell of Mom's pancakes. I felt love safe, like nothing could break us. But by dusk, my parents sat me down, their faces tight, and said I was adopted. Then they told me to leave. Just like that. I didn't cry or fight. I just smiled, nodded because I knew something they didn't. What would you do if your world flipped overnight? Share where you're watching from. And if this hits home, please like and subscribe. I stood in my bedroom, the one I'd known since I was 6, with its faded blue walls and creaky floorboard by the window. My hands shook as I folded a pair of jeans into a duffel bag. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Just hours ago, I'd been blowing out candles, laughing with Ethan over a slice of chocolate cake. Now the house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts scream. I kept seeing their faces at the kitchen table. Margaret's eyes fixed on the floor. Gregory's voice flat as he said, "You're not our daughter. You need to go." I zipped the bag, my fingers brushing the locked wooden box I'd shoved in last. I didn't know why I kept it. It was just this old thing I'd found under my bed years ago, too heavy for its size, like it held more than it should. I couldn't leave it behind, not now. I glanced around, my gaze catching on a small crack in the wall where I'd once drawn a heart in crayon. I was 8, so proud when I showed Margaret. She'd smiled, hugged me, called it beautiful. Now that memory felt like a lie. Downstairs, I found them in the living room. Gregory sat in his armchair, a newspaper open but unread. Margaret stood by the window, her back to me, arms crossed. Ethan was on the stairs, his knees pulled up, watching me like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. I waited for one of them to speak, to explain, to take it back. Instead, Gregory reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the coffee table without looking at me. $200, he said, his voice like gravel, and a bus ticket to Columbus. It leaves in an hour. I stared at the envelope, my chest tightening. $200. That was it. 18 years, and they were sending me off with pocket change and a one-way ticket. I wanted to scream, to ask why they'd waited until now, why they'd let me believe I belonged. But my throat felt locked, like the words were trapped behind a door I couldn't open. Margaret turned slightly, her profile sharp against the fading light. "It's for the best, Amelia," she said, barely above a whisper. "You'll find your way." Her words cut deeper than Gregory's silence. "The best, see, for who?" I looked at Ethan, hoping he'd say something, anything. He just hugged his knees tighter, his eyes glassy. I wanted to shake him, to ask why he wasn't fighting for me, but I didn't. I picked up the envelope, the paper cool against my palm, and tucked it into my jacket. As I stepped toward the front door, my boots echoed on the hardwood. I passed the family photos on the wall, all those smiles from Christmases and summer picnics. I was in most of them, but now I wondered if I'd ever really been part of them. Had they always planned this? Had every hug, every bedtime story been leading to this moment? Outside, the air was crisp, the streetlights just starting to glow. I adjusted the duffel on my shoulder and started walking toward the bus stop. That's when I heard Clara's voice, soft but firm, from her porch next door. "Amelia, wait." I turned. Clara, our neighbor, since forever, stood there in her cardigan, her white hair pulled back. She'd babysat me when I was little, taught me how to braid, let me sneak extra cookies. Her eyes were kind but sharp, like she saw something I didn't. She stepped closer, pressing a folded note into my hand. "Call me if you need me. she said, her voice low. You're stronger than you know. I nodded, too numb to speak, and slipped the note into my pocket. As I walked away, I felt her watching me, like she was holding on to a piece of me I wasn't ready to lose. The bus stop was only a block away, but each step felt heavier, like I was leaving more than just a house behind. I kept thinking about Ethan's silence, Margaret's cold words, the box in my bag. What was I supposed to do now? Where did I even belong? The bus ride to Columbus was a blur of headlights and the low hum of the engine. I sat near the back, my duffel bag wedged between my knees, staring out at the dark fields slipping by. The envelope from Gregory was still in my jacket unopened. I didn't want to touch it, like it would make this real. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger eye's hollow jaw tight. I kept replaying Margaret's words. You'll find your way, and each time, my stomach twisted a little more. Find my way where I was 18 with no plan, no family, just a locked box, and a note from Clara I hadn't dared to read yet. When the bus pulled into the station, the city hit me like a wave. Columbus was all sharp lights and honking cars, nothing like the quiet streets of home. I found a motel a few blocks away, the kind with a flickering neon sign and a clerk who barely looked up from his phone. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet. I dropped my bag on the thin mattress and sat on the edge, the springs creaking under me. For a moment, I thought about calling home, begging them to let me come back. But the memory of Ethan's silence stopped me. He hadn't even said goodbye. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my journal, its leather cover worn from years of late-night scribbles. Flipping through, I stopped at a page from last summer, a list of dreams I'd written after a family barbecue. Move to a big city, study art, make mom and dad proud. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the empty room. Proud. They didn't even want me. I slammed the journal shut, but something slipped out, a small creased drawing I'd tucked inside years ago. It was a picture I'd made at 10, a wobbly sketch of our house with 4 stick figures labeled Me, Ethan, Mom, Dad. I'd given it to Margaret for Mother's Day. She'd hung it on the fridge for a week, then it disappeared. I found it later, shoved in a kitchen drawer with old receipts. I held it now, my thumb tracing the faded crayon lines, and felt a pang so sharp it stole my breath. The next morning, I walked to a diner I'd seen near the motel, its sign promising cheap coffee and breakfast all day. My $200 wouldn't last long, and I needed a job. The manager, a wiry guy named Carl, looked me over with a raised eyebrow, but handed me an application. "You ever waitressed?" he asked, chewing a toothpick. I lied, said I had, and he shrugged. "Start tomorrow. Don't mess up." Work was a grind. The diner was always busy, plates, clattering customers snapping for refills. My feet ached after every shift, and tips were barely enough to cover the motel, but it was something a tether to keep me from falling apart. I met Jasmine on my 3rd day, a waitress with a quick laugh and tired eyes. She was 25, raising a 4-year-old alone, and she took me under her wing, showing me how to balance trays and dodge Carl's bad moods. Over greasy fries after a shift, she asked why I'd come to Columbus. I hesitated, then told her the truth, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. She listened, nodding, then reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Family can break you," she said. "But you get to choose who you keep close." Her words stuck with me, but they didn't dull the ache. At night, alone in the motel, I'd lie awake, the locked box on the nightstand, like a silent question. I hadn't opened it, not yet. It felt too final, like whatever was inside would change everything. Instead, I clung to my journal, writing fragments of thoughts I couldn't say out loud. Why did they lie? Did Ethan know what's in Clara's note? I pulled it out once, unfolded it, and saw her neat handwriting, a phone number, and 3 words: "You are enough." I wanted to believe her, but I didn't know how. A week into my new life, I worked up the nerve to call home. My hands shook as I dialed from the motel's payphone, the receiver cold against my ear. Margaret answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" Her voice was clipped like she knew it was me. I swallowed my throat dry. "It's Amelia. Can we talk?" There was a long pause, then a sigh. "You're not our responsibility anymore," she said, and the line went dead. I stood there, the dial tone buzzing, feeling like the ground had dropped out from under me. She hadn't even let me speak. I slid down the wall knees to my chest and pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to hold back the tears. They didn't want me. They never had. Back in my room, I opened my journal again, but this time I didn't write. I just sat there, staring at the drawing of our family, the stick figures blurring as my eyes burned. I thought about Jasmine, about Clara's note about the box I was too scared to open. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that they'd thrown me out or the fact that I still wanted them to care. But something was shifting inside me, a spark of anger, small but growing. They thought they could erase me, but I wasn't gone yet. Not even close. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I wiped down a sticky table, the rag damp in my hand. It was my 2nd week in Columbus, and the routine was starting to feel like a cage. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. My motel room was a revolving door of roaches and bad dreams, and the $200 from Gregory was nearly gone. I kept Clara's note taped to the mirror, her words staring back at me every morning. "You are enough." But enough for what I wasn't so sure anymore. Jasmine was my saving grace. She'd slip me extra fries during breaks and talk about her daughter Lila with a glow that made me ache for something I couldn't name. Today, she leaned against the counter braiding her hair while we waited for the lunch rush. "You holding up okay, Amelia?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. I nodded, forcing a smile, but my mind was elsewhere. Last night, I'd found something in my journal tucked between pages of old poetry. A photograph, small and worn, of me as a toddler, maybe 2 years old, sitting on a woman's lap. She had dark hair, a warm smile, and eyes that looked like mine. It wasn't Margaret. I'd stared at it for hours, a faint memory stirring like a song I couldn't quite place. I didn't tell Jasmine about the photo. It felt too raw, like exposing a wound. Instead, I shrugged and said, "Just tired. Long shifts." She raised an eyebrow but didn't push. The bell above the door jingled, and a group of truckers shuffled in barking orders before they even sat down. I grabbed my notepad and got to work, but my hands were clumsy, spilling coffee on a guy's sleeve. He cursed loud enough for the whole diner to hear, and I mumbled an apology, my face burning. Carl shot me a look from the kitchen, his toothpick twitching. I could feel the weight of everything piling up, the rejection, the uncertainty, the photo I couldn't unsee. After my shift, I sat in the break room, my apron crumpled on the table. Jasmine slid into the chair across from me, her shift over too. "Talk to me," she said, no nonsense in her tone. I hesitated, then pulled the photo from my pocket. Her eyes softened as she studied it. "This your mom?" she asked. I shook my head. "I don't know who she is. Found it last night. It's not Margaret." Jasmine handed it back, her expression serious. "You deserve to know where you come from, Amelia. Nobody gets to take that from you." Her words lit something in me, a mix of anger and need. I walked back to the motel, the photo in my hand, and pulled out my phone. I hadn't tried calling home since Margaret hung up on me, but I needed answers. Not from her, though. From Ethan. He was the only one who might tell me something real. My fingers hovered over his number, my heart pounding. What if he ignored me too? I hit call anyway. He picked up on the second ring, his voice low like he was hiding. Amelia. You okay? I could hear a TV in the background, the clink of dishes. I pictured him in the kitchen sneaking away from our parents. I'm fine. I lied, my voice sharper than I meant. I found a photo, Ethan. Me with some woman. Not Mom. You know anything about it? There was a long pause, and I could almost see him fidgeting the way he did when he was nervous. I don't know, he said, finally too quick. Maybe it's nothing. Bullshit, I snapped, surprising myself. You're lying. I can hear it. My grip tightened on the phone, the photo creasing in my other hand. Ethan sighed, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. I can't talk about it, okay? They'd kill me. Just don't ask. Before I could push, I heard Margaret's voice in the background calling his name. The line went dead. I threw the phone onto the bed, my breath coming fast. He knew something. He'd always known, hadn't he? All those years, the way he got new sneakers while I wore thrift store shoes, the way Margaret bragged about his grades, but forgot my art shows. I thought it was just favoritism, but it was more. They'd kept me at arm's length, and Ethan had been part of it. I paced the room, the walls closing in, and stopped at the nightstand where the locked box sat. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the rough wood, but I pulled back. Not yet. I wasn't ready for whatever was inside. I sank onto the bed, the photo still in my hand. The woman's smile haunted me. Her arms around me like I was hers. Who was she? Why had they hidden her? The anger was growing now, hot and sharp, not just at Margaret and Gregory, but at Ethan, at the life they'd let me believe was mine. I wanted to scream, to break something, but all I could do was clutch the photo and let the hurt burn. The motel room felt smaller after Ethan hung up, like the walls were squeezing me in. I sat on the bed, the springs groaning, my phone still warm from the call. His whisper, "Don't ask," echoed in my head, each word a fresh cut. He was hiding something, just like they always had. I wanted to call back to scream until he told me the truth, but my hands wouldn't move. Instead, I picked up the locked box, its weight heavy in my lap, and traced the carved initials on the lid, E.L. Who was that? Why did it feel like the answer was just out of reach? I shoved the box under the bed and grabbed my jacket, needing air. The city streets were alive with noise, car horns, and distant laughter, but I felt like a ghost drifting through it all. I ended up at a corner store buying a cheap pack of gum to keep my hands busy. The cashier, an older guy with deep lines around his eyes, smiled as he handed me my change. "Rough night, kid?" he asked. I nodded, too tired to fake it, and left without another word. His kindness stung, a reminder of what I didn't have anymore. Back at the diner the next day, I was a mess. I dropped a plate of pancakes, the syrup splattering across the floor, and Carl barked at me to clean it up. Jasmine shot me a worried look, but I waved her off, scrubbing the tiles like I could scrub away the ache in my chest. During a lull, I checked my phone, hoping for a text from Ethan, an apology, anything. Instead, I found a message he'd sent late last night after our call. "They're selling your stuff." I tried to stop them. "I'm sorry." My breath caught, and I reread it, each word sinking deeper. My stuff. My books, my sketch pads, the quilt I'd sewn with Margaret when I was 12. They were erasing me piece by piece. I slipped into the bathroom, locking the door, and leaned against the sink, my reflection pale in the cracked mirror. I could still see the quilt in my mind, its patchwork squares in blues and greens, the way Margaret had laughed when I pricked my finger with the needle. We'd spent weeks on it, her hands guiding mine. Now it was probably in a dumpster, or worse, sold to some stranger for a few bucks. I gripped the sink, My knuckles white and felt a sob building, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't fall apart, not here. When my shift ended, I walked to the library, needing somewhere quiet to think. The building was old, with tall windows and rows of dusty books. I wandered to a computer and started searching for anything about my family, my real family. I typed in Margaret and Gregory's names, then hesitated before adding adoption. Nothing useful came up, just dead ends. I tried EL, the initials on the box, but got thousands of hits, none relevant. Frustration clawed at me, and I slammed my hand on the desk, earning a glare from a librarian. I mumbled an apology and sank back in my chair, defeated. That night, I sat on the motel floor, my journal open but blank. I couldn't write, couldn't find words for the rage and hurt twisting inside me. They were selling my things like I'd never existed. Ethan knew more than he was saying, and Margaret's voice from that phone call, cold and final, kept playing on a loop. I pulled out Clara's note again, staring at her handwriting. "You are enough." But I didn't feel it. I felt like nothing, like a shadow they'd swept out of their lives. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over Ethan's number again. I wanted to demand answers, to make him tell me why they'd done this, why he'd let them. But before I could call, another text came through, this one with a photo. It was my old desk, the one I'd carved my initials into at 14, sitting in the driveway with a for sale sign taped to it. Ethan's message followed. "I'm so sorry." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring, the anger boiling over into something darker, something that scared me. They weren't just kicking me out. They were wiping me away, and I didn't know how to stop them. I couldn't sleep that night, Ethan's text burning behind my eyes, the image of my desk with that for sale sign like a slap. I sat on the motel floor, my back against the wall, the locked box in front of me. It had been a shadow in my life for years, always there, always ignored. But now it felt like the only thing tying me to something real. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the lid, the carved initials EL, smooth under my touch. I didn't know what I'd find, but I couldn't keep running from it. I grabbed a butter knife from the diner's takeout bag I'd left on the nightstand, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the city noise outside. The lock was old, rusted, and after a few twists, it gave way with a soft snap. I lifted the lid, the hinges creaking, and my breath caught. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, a small silver locket, and a creased birth certificate. I reached for the letter first, my fingers clumsy, like I was handling something fragile enough to break. The handwriting was neat, slanted, unfamiliar. "Dear Amelia," it began, and my chest tightened at my name. "If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. My name is Eileen, and I'm your mother." I stopped, the words blurring. Eileen, EL, my mother, not Margaret. I forced myself to keep reading each sentence like a weight dropping. She wrote about loving me, about giving me up to protect me. Then came the truth that broke something inside me. I was the result of an affair, hers, with Gregory. Margaret had agreed to adopt me to hide the scandal, to keep their perfect family image intact. Eileen had been forced out, silenced, and she died a year later, alone. I set the letter down, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold it. Gregory, my father, not just in name, but in blood. And Margaret, who'd raised me, had known all along, had chosen to bury the truth. I felt sick, like the room was spinning. I picked up the birth certificate, my name printed clear. Amelia Lynn, mother. Eileen Lynn, father. Gregory Holt. It was real. They'd lied to me my whole life, not just about who I was, but why I was even here. The locket was next cool against my palm. I clicked it open, and inside was a tiny photo of Eileen, her dark hair framing a face so much like mine it hurt to look at. She was smiling, holding a baby me, her eyes full of love. I snapped it shut, my throat burning. They'd taken her from me, not just her life, but her memory, her voice. I thought of every time Margaret had corrected my manners, every time Gregory had dismissed my questions, every time I'd felt like I didn't belong. It wasn't me. It was them, hiding their shame, using me to keep their secret. I stood pacing the small room, the letter crumpled in my fist. My whole life was a lie built to protect their reputation. They'd kicked me out, not because I wasn't theirs, but because I was too much theirs, a living reminder of Gregory's betrayal. I wanted to scream, to tear the letter apart, but I couldn't. It was all I had of her, of Eileen. I sank to the floor, clutching the locket, and let the tears come hot and silent. I wasn't just abandoned. I was erased, a problem they'd solved by shoving me out the door. Jasmine's voice echoed in my head, her warning from days ago. You deserve to know where you come from. She was right. But this truth was a blade cutting deeper than I'd ever imagined. I thought of Ethan, his guilty texts, his whispered excuses. Did he know about the affair? Had he been part of their lie too? The thought made my stomach twist, a new betrayal, layering over the old. I needed to know, needed to hear it from him. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over his number, the locket still in my other hand. This wasn't over. Not yet. I clutched the phone, my thumb frozen over Ethan's number, the locket digging into my palm. The motel's thin walls let in the muffled sound of a couple arguing next door, their voices a dull roar against my racing thoughts. I couldn't call him, not yet. My head was too loud, Eileen's letter still searing my mind. I needed to see him, to look him in the eyes, and know if he'd been lying to me too. I shoved the letter and birth certificate back into the box, but kept the locket out, looping its chain around my neck. It felt like an anchor, heavy, but grounding. The next morning, I was wiping down tables at the diner when my phone buzzed in my apron. A text from Ethan. I'm in Columbus. Can we meet? My heart lurched. He was here. I typed back, giving him the diner's address, my hands unsteady. Jasmine caught my eye from across the counter, her brow furrowed. You okay? She asked, tossing a rag over her shoulder. I nodded, but my stomach was in knots. I didn't tell her about Ethan. This felt too personal, too fragile to share. He showed up just after the lunch rush, his hoodie damp from a light drizzle outside. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting like he was scared to be here. I led him to a booth in the corner, the vinyl seats squeaking as we sat. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease, and the clatter of dishes felt too loud for what I needed to say. Why are you here? I asked, my voice low, sharper than I meant. Ethan fidgeted with a sugar packet, tearing it open and letting the grains spill. I had to see you, he said, barely meeting my gaze. Things at home, they're bad. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I leaned forward, the locket swinging against my chest. Quiet about what, Ethan? The affair, Eileen, me. His eyes widened, and he froze, the sugar packet crumpling in his hand. You know, he whispered, his voice cracking. I nodded, my throat tight. I found her letter. I know I'm Gregory's. I know they adopted me to cover it up. Ethan's face crumpled, and he looked away, his jaw working. I was 12, he said, so quiet, I almost missed it. I overheard them fighting. Dad was drunk, yelling about some woman, about a kid. Mom made me swear not to tell. Said it'd ruin us. He finally looked at me, his eyes wet. I didn't know it was you, not at first. Not until later. The words hit like a punch. He'd known for years, carried their secret while I lived in their house, clueless. I thought of the times he'd gotten new bike trips to baseball games while I got chores and silence. You let me think I was part of the family, I said, my voice shaking. You watched them push me out and did nothing. Ethan flinched, but I didn't stop. They sold my desk, Ethan, my quilt, my life. And you're sorry. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back the table between us, a chasm. I tried to stop them, he said, his voice desperate. I hid some of your stuff in my room, but Mom found it. She said you were gone, that it didn't matter. My chest burned, a mix of rage and grief. Margaret hadn't just kicked me out. She'd made sure I was nothing to them. I pictured her rifling through my things, tossing them like trash, and felt a sob lodge in my throat. Before I could speak, Jasmine appeared, her apron smudged with ketchup. Everything okay over here? She asked, her eyes flicking between us. I nodded, but my face must have betrayed me, because she lingered her hand on my shoulder. Ethan stood, shoving his hands in his pockets. I'm sorry, Amelia, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't want this. He turned and walked out, the bell above the door jangling as he left. I sat there staring at the spilled sugar on the table, the locket heavy against my skin. Ethan had known since he was 12, had carried their lie, while I called him brother. Margaret and Gregory hadn't just hidden the truth. They'd built a wall around it, and Ethan had helped. The diner blurred around me, the chatter fading to a dull hum. I felt hollow, like everything I'd ever believed about family had been ripped away, leaving nothing but ashes. I didn't know how to move forward, how to carry this weight. All I knew was that it hurt deeper than I could stand. I stayed in that diner booth long after Ethan left, the sugar he'd spilled still scattered across the table like tiny shards of glass. Jasmine's hand on my shoulder was the only thing keeping me grounded, but even her warmth couldn't dull the ache. Ethan's confession, his years of silence, had torn open a wound I didn't know I had. I felt like I was drowning in their lies, in the weight of being a secret they'd buried. But something else was stirring, a quiet fire in my chest, telling me I couldn't let them write the end of my story. I walked back to the motel, the locket bouncing against my collarbone with every step. The city was quieter now, the streets slick from the earlier rain reflecting the glow of neon signs. In my room, I pulled out the letter from Eileen, smoothing it on the bed. Her words, her love for me, felt like a lifeline. She'd wanted me to know her, to know myself. Margaret and Gregory had stolen that from us, but I wasn't going to let them steal my voice too. I made up my mind. I was going back to that house not to beg, but to face them, to lay their truth bare. I spent the next morning at the diner, my shift a blur of pouring coffee and dodging Carl's glares. Between orders, I scribbled notes on a napkin, rehearsing what I'd say to them. I want to know why you lied, why you made me feel like nothing, why you threw me away. The words felt clumsy, but they were mine, and that was enough. Jasmine noticed my distraction and cornered me during a break, her arms crossed. What's going on with you today? She asked, her eyes narrowing. I hesitated, then told her about the letter, about Ethan's visit, about my plan to go back. She listened, her face unreadable, then grabbed my hand. You're not doing this alone, she said, her voice firm. You need someone in your corner. I started to protest, but she cut me off. I've been where you are, Amelia, facing family that hurt you. It's heavy. Let me help. Her offer caught me off guard, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of strength, like I wasn't carrying this all by myself. That afternoon, I borrowed Jasmine's beat-up sedan, promising to be back by morning. The drive to my hometown was 3 hours, and I kept the radio off, letting my thoughts churn. I pictured the house, its white siding and creaky porch, swing the place I'd once called home. I saw Margaret's tight-lipped frown, Gregory's cold stare, and my resolve hardened. I wasn't their secret anymore. I was Eileen's daughter, and I deserved answers. I stopped at a gas station, halfway, the air thick with the smell of fuel and fried food. While I filled the tank, I pulled out my phone and texted Clara, the neighbor who'd given me her number. "I'm coming back today. Need to talk to them. Can you meet me there?" Her reply came fast. "I'll be there. Bring your heart, child." I didn't know what she meant, but her words steadied me like a hand on my back. By the time I pulled into my old street, the sky was turning pink, the houses glowing in the dusk. My pulse raced as I parked across from the house, its windows dark except for a faint light in the living room. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, Eileen's locket warm against my skin. This was it. No more hiding, no more silence. I grabbed the wooden box from the passenger seat, the letter and birth certificate tucked inside, and stepped out of the car. My boots crunched on the gravel, each step pulling me closer to the truth I'd been denied. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I was ready to face it, to claim the pieces of myself they'd tried to erase. The front door of the house loomed before me, its chipped red paint, a reminder of summers spent repainting it with Gregory, back when I thought his gruff instructions were love. I tightened my grip on the wooden box, Eileen's letter inside, like a heartbeat. My legs felt unsteady, but I climbed the porch steps, each creak louder than the last. I knocked the sound sharp in the quiet evening and waited, my breath shallow. The locket rested against my chest, a silent promise to the mother I'd never known. Margaret opened the door, her face paling when she saw me. She wore a faded cardigan, her hair pulled back tightly, and for a moment I saw the woman who'd tucked me in at night, her hands soft but firm. Then her eyes hardened. "What are you doing here, Amelia?" she asked, her voice clipped like I was a stranger. I swallowed my rehearsed words, faltering. "I need to talk," I said, lifting the box slightly. "About this." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, then stepped aside. The living room smelled of lemon cleaner, the same scent that used to cling to her after Saturday chores. Gregory sat in his armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the TV droning softly. He looked up, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not moving. I stood in the center of the room, the box heavy in my arms, and felt Clara's presence before I saw her stepping in behind me, her footsteps soft but steady. "Amelia has a right to be here," Clara said, her voice calm but unyielding. She held a small photo in her hand, one I hadn't seen before, and placed it on the coffee table. It was Eileen younger, laughing in a garden, her arm around a teenage Clara. My heart skipped. Clara had known her, had carried this piece of my mother all these years. Margaret's eyes flicked to the photo, and she froze, her hands twisting in her lap. I set the box on the table and opened it, pulling out Eileen's letter and the birth certificate. My voice was steady, though my insides churned. "I know about the affair," I said, looking at Gregory. "I know I'm your daughter, not just some kid you took in. You lied to me my whole life." I held up the letter, my hand trembling but firm. Eileen wrote this. She loved me. You took that from her, from me. Gregory's glass hit the table with a thud, his face reddening. "That's nonsense," he snapped, leaning forward. "You don't know what you're talking about." But his voice shook, and I saw it, the crack in his armor. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. She stared at the letter like it was a ghost, her fingers digging into her cardigan. Clara stepped closer, her eyes on Margaret. "I knew Eileen," she said quietly. "She was my friend. She begged you to tell Amelia the truth one day. You promised her." Margaret's breath hitched, and she looked away, her face crumpling. I felt a surge of something not triumph, but clarity. They couldn't hide anymore. I turned to Gregory, my voice rising despite myself. You kicked me out to keep this buried, didn't you? You let me think I was nothing. Let me leave with $200 and a bus ticket, all to protect your name. My words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Gregory's mouth opened, then closed his eyes, darting to Margaret. She spoke then, her voice barely audible. We thought it was better this way. For everyone. Better? The word stung sharper than any slap. I wanted to yell to ask how erasing me was better, but Clara's hand brushed my arm, grounding me. I looked at the photo of Eileen again, her smile so alive, and felt a strength I hadn't known I had. You don't get to decide what's better for me. I said, my voice low, each word deliberate. Not anymore. I stepped back, the box still open on the table, the letter and photo exposed. Margaret's eyes were wet, but she didn't move. Gregory stared at the floor, his glass forgotten. Clara nodded at me, a silent approval. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding, but lighter, like I'd shed a weight I'd carried too long. I paused at the threshold, looking back at them one last time. Their silence was louder than any words, and in it, I found my own voice. I walked out the locket, warm against my skin, and didn't look back. I drove away from the house, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold against the night. Jasmine's car rattled beneath me, the engine's hum the only sound as I left my old life behind. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside, I was a storm, Eileen's locket still warm against my chest. I'd said what I needed to lay their secrets bare, but the weight of it hadn't lifted. It was heavier now, sharper like a truth too big to carry alone. Clara's quiet nod as I left Margaret's broken expression, Gregory's silence, they clung to me, each a thread I couldn't cut. Back in Columbus, the motel room felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I dropped the wooden box on the bed, its lid still open, Eileen's letter folded neatly inside. I didn't look at it. Instead, I sank onto the floor, my back against the wall, and let the quiet settle. The confrontation had been my choice, my voice. But what came next? I'd expected yelling, maybe tears. But their muted responses left me hollow. Margaret's weak. It was better this way, echoed in my mind. Not an apology, just a justification. Gregory hadn't even tried to deny it. They'd offered nothing, and I'd walked away. But the victory felt empty. The next morning, I was back at the diner, pouring coffee with mechanical precision. Jasmine was off, and the absence of her quick smile made the shift drag. Carl muttered about my slow pace, but I barely heard him. My phone buzzed in my apron, and I slipped into the break room to check it. A text from Ethan, I'm leaving too. Can't stay after what they did. My stomach twisted. He was running just like me, but his words didn't bridge the gap between us. He'd known their lie for years, and that betrayal still stung a wound too fresh to touch. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on the tables, the clink of plates, the murmur of customers. But my mind kept drifting to the house, to the way Margaret's hands had trembled, the way Gregory's glass had sat untouched. They hadn't fought back, hadn't chased me out. It was worse, they'd let me go like I was a chapter they'd already closed. I thought of the photo Clara brought, Eileen's laugh frozen in time, and wondered if they'd ever loved me even a little, or if I'd always been a reminder of their shame. By noon, a regular and older woman named Diane, who always ordered tea, noticed my distraction. You look like you're carrying the world, sweetheart, she said, her voice kind but probing. I managed a smile, muttering something about a long week, but her words stuck. Carrying the world. That's what it felt like, every step weighted with questions I couldn't answer. Who was I to them? Who was I to myself? After my shift, I walked to the library, needing space to breathe. The air was crisp, the streets lined with early fall leaves crunching under my boots. I didn't head to the computers this time. Instead, I wandered the stacks, my fingers trailing over book spines, searching for something I couldn't name. I ended up in the local history section where a display caught my eye. Old newspapers, some from the year I was born. On impulse, I pulled one from the shelf, flipping through brittle pages, until a small article stopped me cold. It was about a poetry reading at a community center featuring a young woman named Eileen Lynn. The grainy photo showed her mid-sentence, her hands raised, her face alive with passion. My mother. I sat at a table, the newspaper spread before me, and read the article twice. Eileen had been a poet, her words described as raw, unflinching. The piece mentioned her sudden death a year later, no cause given. I touched the photo, my throat tight, and felt a connection, fragile but real. She'd been here in this city, leaving pieces of herself for me to find. But the joy of discovery was laced with pain. Margaret and Gregory had known her, had silenced her, and now they were trying to silence me too. I left the library, the article photocopied, and tucked in my pocket, my steps heavier than when I'd arrived. Their lack of fight, Ethan's escape, Eileen's stolen life, it all pressed down a truth I'd forced into the open, but couldn't yet resolve. I reached for the locket, its edges familiar now, and stopped walking the street, quiet around me. I'd spoken my piece, but their silence was an answer I hadn't expected, and it left me stranded, caught between rage and a grief I couldn't name. The photocopied article about Eileen stayed in my pocket as I walked back to the motel, its edges crinkling with every step. The city's pulse felt distant, like I was moving through a fog. I'd faced Margaret and Gregory, spilled their secret, but the aftermath wasn't what I'd imagined. No apologies, no closure, just their stunned faces, and a silence that cut deeper than words. I'd wanted them to see me, to feel the weight of what they'd done, but their quiet surrender left me unmoored, like I'd shouted into a void. At the diner the next day, I moved through my shift, like a shadow taking orders, clearing plates, my mind elsewhere. Jasmine was back, her presence a small comfort, but I didn't tell her about the confrontation. Not yet. She'd ask questions, and I wasn't ready to unravel it all. Instead, I focused on the routine, the clatter of cutlery, the hiss of the coffee machine. But when a customer left a family photo on a table, a Polaroid of 2 kids and a smiling mom, I froze, my hands hovering over the empty plates. I slipped it into my apron, telling myself I'd return it later. But I knew I wouldn't. It was a piece of something I'd never had, something Margaret and Gregory had dangled, then snatched away. That evening, I moved out of the motel, my few belongings packed into Jasmine's car. She'd insisted I stay with her, saying her couch was better than that roach-infested room. Her apartment was small, cluttered with Lila's toys and stacks of laundry, but it smelled of lavender and felt alive. Lila greeted me with a shy wave, clutching a stuffed bunny, and I managed a smile, though my heart was still raw. Jasmine handed me a blanket, her eyes searching mine. "You don't have to talk," she said, "but I'm here when you do." I nodded, grateful for her silence, and settled onto the couch, the box with Eileen's letter at my feet. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, the city's hum filtering through the window, and thought about Ethan's text. He was gone now, out of that house, but his choice felt like another abandonment, a reminder of his years of complicity. I wondered where he was, if he carried the same guilt I did. The locket pressed against my skin, a faint warmth, and I pictured Eileen's face from the newspaper, her poet's intensity. I wanted to know her, to trace the life they'd erased, but the thought of digging deeper scared me. What if all I found was more pain? The next day, a package arrived at the diner, addressed to me in Clara's careful handwriting. I opened it in the break room, my hands unsteady. Inside was a slim journal, its cover faded leather, with a note from Clara. Eileen's words. "She'd want you to have them." I flipped it open, and her handwriting filled the pages, Poems about love loss and a daughter she'd never hold again. One line hit me like a stone. They'll bury my truth, but not my light. I closed the journal, my eyes burning, and tucked it into my bag. Clara's gift was a bridge to Eileen, but it also sharpened the sting of what Margaret and Gregory had done. They'd stolen her voice just as they'd tried to steal mine. I walked home to Jasmine's that night, the journal heavy in my bag, the city's lights casting long shadows. A coworker, a loud guy named Marcus, had started whispering about my past, his smirks following me through shifts. I ignored him, but the gossip stung, a reminder that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was out there raw and exposed, and I couldn't control how people saw it. I stopped by a park, sitting on a bench under a street lamp, and opened Eileen's journal again. Her words were fierce, unapologetic, and I felt a pull like she was daring me to keep going. But the weight of it all, the confrontation, the rumors, Ethan's absence pressed down until I could barely breathe. I looked up at the sky, the stars faint against the city's glow, and felt the locket against my chest. I'd forced the truth into the open, but the cost was this: a family I couldn't reclaim, a brother who'd chosen his own path, and a mother I'd never know. I closed my eyes, Eileen's words echoing in my mind, and let the silence swallow me. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a pause, a moment, where I was just Amelia carrying a light no one could bury. I woke to the smell of coffee and the soft clatter of dishes in Jasmine's kitchen. Her apartment had become my home, the couch, a familiar nest of blankets where I'd spent weeks piecing myself together. The morning light slanted through the window, catching specks of dust in the air, and I lay still for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. It was a new kind of quiet, not the heavy silence of the motel, but something softer, like the world was giving me room to breathe. I reached for the locket around my neck, its familiar weight a steady reminder of Eileen, and felt a calm I hadn't known in months. I'd started a routine, something to anchor me. Mornings at the diner, evenings at the community college where I'd enrolled in a literature class, my first step toward a future I could shape. The campus was a short bus ride away, all red brick and sprawling lawns, and I'd sit in the lecture hall, my notebook open, soaking in discussions about books I'd never read before. It wasn't just the stories, it was the way they made me see myself, a girl who'd been written off, but was still here, still writing her own pages. Today was Saturday, my day off, and I walked to a nearby cafe, a cozy spot with mismatched chairs and the hum of conversation. I ordered a chai latte, the spice warm on my tongue, and settled by the window with Eileen's journal. Her poems were my compass now, each one a glimpse into a woman who'd loved fiercely despite her pain. I read a new one about a river that carried secrets, but never stopped flowing, and felt a tug in my chest, like she was speaking to me across time. I pulled out my own notebook and started writing, not a poem, but fragments, thoughts about who I was becoming. A daughter, a survivor, a voice. The cafe buzzed around me, students typing on laptops, a couple laughing over pastries, but I felt apart from it, wrapped in my own world. I thought about the diner, how I'd started smiling at customers not just out of habit, but because I wanted to. I thought about Lila Jasmine's daughter, who'd started drawing me pictures, her crayons scratching out bright flowers and lopsided hearts. They were small things, but they were mine proof I was building something new. I flipped to a blank page and wrote a question. What does family mean? I didn't have an answer, not fully, but I knew it wasn't just blood. It was Jasmine leaving a plate of leftovers for me after a late shift. It was Clara mailing me Eileen's journal, trusting me with her friend's legacy. It was even the professor who'd stopped me after class to say my essay on loss was honest raw. These were my people, not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. I looked out the window, watching leaves skitter across the sidewalk, and felt the locket again, its edges worn from my constant touch. I wasn't over the hurt, not completely. Margaret and Gregory's faces still crept into my dreams, their silence a scar I'd always carry. But I wasn't chasing their approval anymore. I was chasing myself, the girl Eileen had believed in, the one I was learning to believe in too. I sipped my latte, the warmth spreading through me, and let the thought settle. For the first time, it didn't feel like running. It felt like growing. I left the cafe with my notebook tucked under my arm. The streets of Columbus quiet under a gray afternoon sky. My boots scuffed against the pavement, a rhythm that matched the steady beat of my thoughts. I'd started wearing Eileen's locket every day, not just as a keepsake, but as a choice, a way to carry her with me. It wasn't about clinging to the past anymore. It was about claiming the parts of it that made me whole. I headed toward a local community center, a place I'd passed before, but never entered, drawn by a flyer I'd seen about an open mic night. The center was a low brick building, its walls lined with posters for art classes and book clubs. Inside it smelled of fresh paint and old wood, the kind of place that held stories in its corners. I signed up on a whim, my name scribbled on a clipboard by a volunteer with a warm smile. The room was small, maybe 20 people scattered across folding chairs, their faces lit by a single spotlight on a makeshift stage. I sat near the back, my notebook in my lap, my stomach fluttering. I hadn't planned to read, but Eileen's journal was in my bag, and her words felt like a dare. When my name was called, I stood, my legs shaky, but my resolve firm. The spotlight was brighter than I expected, warming my face as I opened my notebook. I didn't read Eileen's poems. I read my own, a short piece I'd written about a girl who found her voice in the ashes of a home she'd lost. My voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier, each word a step into a place I'd never been. The room was silent, not the heavy silence of judgment, but the kind that listens. When I finished, there was soft applause, a few nods, and a stranger's quiet. "Thank you." I sat down, my heart full, not with pride, but with something gentler, like I'd set something free. Later, back at Jasmine's, I found Lila coloring at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration. She looked up, her eyes bright, and said, "Aunt Amelia, look." She held up a drawing of a house with a big sun above it, stick figures labeled with our names. I knelt beside her, my throat tight, and hugged her, her small arms wrapping around me. "It's perfect," I whispered, and she giggled, calling me Aunt Amelia again, the name settling into me like a truth I hadn't earned, but wanted to keep. Ethan texted that evening, his first message in weeks. He was in therapy, he said, trying to untangle the mess of our family. He didn't ask to meet, didn't push, just said he was proud of me. I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the screen, then set the phone down without replying. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready to rebuild that bridge. Not yet. He was finding his way, and I was finding mine, and that was enough for now. Before bed, I found a letter from Margaret in the mail, her handwriting stiff on the envelope. She wanted to talk, to explain, she wrote. I held it over the trash, my fingers twitching, then set it unopened on the counter. I didn't need her words to move forward. I'd spent too long waiting for them to see me, to love me. Now I was learning to see myself, and that was a gift they couldn't take back. I stood by the window, looking out at the city's soft glow, the locket cool against my skin. The world felt wide, not empty, but open like a page I was still writing. I breathed slow, the air filling my lungs, and let the moment hold me. I wasn't healed, not fully, but I was here standing in a life I'd chosen, and that was more than they'd ever given me. I turned 19 on a cool September morning, the kind where the air smells like fresh leaves and second chances. Jasmine's apartment was alive with the clink of plates and Lila's giggles as we set up a small party, just the three of us, and a homemade vanilla cake. The table was crowded with candles and a few balloons Lila had picked out their colors bright against the worn wood. I stood back watching Jasmine light the candles, her face soft in the glow, and felt a warmth settle in me, not loud, but steady, like a fire that wouldn't go out. I'd been living with them for months now, the couch my own little corner of the world. I'd found a rhythm waking early to catch the bus to my literature classes. My backpack, heavy with books, I was starting to love. The college campus felt less daunting now, its paths familiar under my sneakers. I'd sit under an oak tree between lectures, my notebook open, jotting down thoughts that weren't just about pain anymore, but about possibility. I was studying poetry drawn to the way words could hold both hurt and hope, and every line I read felt like a step closer to understanding myself. Work at the diner was still grueling, but I'd grown to like the chaos the way it kept me moving. I'd learned the regulars' orders by heart, their small talk, a kind of tether to the world. There was a man, Henry, who came in every Tuesday for eggs and toast, always leaving a generous tip with a quiet nod. Last week, he'd asked about my classes, his eyes crinkling when I told him about a poem I'd analyzed. "You've got a spark, kid," he said, and I carried those words home, turning them over like a smooth stone in my pocket. Jasmine and Lila were my anchors. After dinner, we'd sprawl on the living room floor, Lila teaching me how to braid her doll's hair, while Jasmine teased us both. One night, Lila fell asleep against my shoulder, her breathing soft, and Jasmine looked at me, her smile knowing. "You're good for her," she said, and I felt a lump in my throat, not sadness, but gratitude. I was part of something here, not because I had to be, but because I was wanted. I'd started gardening with Clara too, a ritual that began when I visited her in my hometown. Her backyard was a patchwork of flower beds, and we'd spend afternoons kneeling in the dirt, planting bulbs she said would bloom come spring. The soil was cool under my fingers, its grit a kind of honesty. Clara didn't talk much, but her presence was enough, her hands steady as she showed me how to press seeds into the earth. I'd brought a small pot of daisies back to Jasmine's, keeping it on the windowsill, their white petals a quiet nod to the woman I was becoming. I still wore the locket every day, its silver warmed by my skin. It wasn't just Eileen's anymore. It was mine, a choice to hold on to the parts of my story that mattered. I'd stopped waiting for Margaret and Gregory to reach out. Their letter sat unopened in a drawer, not out of anger, but because I didn't need their words to define me. Ethan had called once, his voice tentative, saying he was settling in a new city trying to rebuild. I listened, wished him well, and hung up my heart calm. We were separate now, not enemies, but not family either, and I was okay with that. As the candles flickered on my birthday cake, I made a wish not for answers or apologies, but for the strength to keep going. I blew them out, Lila clapping wildly, and Jasmine sliced the cake, her laughter filling the room. I took a bite, the sweetness spreading across my tongue, and looked around at this life I'd built, small but real. The past was still there, a shadow I'd always carry, but it didn't own me anymore. I was here in this moment, and for now, that was enough. The days after my birthday settled into a quiet rhythm, like a song I was learning to hum. I'd taken to walking by the river near Jasmine's apartment, a narrow path where the water rippled under the weight of fallen leaves. The current was steady, unhurried, and I'd sit on a bench, my hands in my coat pockets, watching the light dance on the surface. It was here in these stolen moments that I began to understand what I'd been carrying and what I could finally set down. The locket still hung around my neck, but it felt lighter now. Not a burden, but a bridge to a woman whose strength I was starting to claim as my own. I'd enrolled in a second class, a writing workshop, where I spent evenings shaping my thoughts into stories. The instructor, a woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice, read one of my pieces aloud about a girl who found home in the spaces between loss. She paused after looked at me and said, This is truth. I didn't cry, but I felt something shift like a door opening inside me. I was telling my story, not theirs, and each word was a step toward a life I could call mine. One afternoon, I visited the community center again, not for an open mic, but to help with a kids' art class Lila had begged to join. The room was chaos paint smudged on tables, kids laughing as they smeared colors on paper. I knelt beside Lila, guiding her brush, and caught her grinning at me, her front tooth missing. "You're my best friend?" she whispered, and I laughed my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible. Later, as we cleaned up, the volunteer coordinator thanked me, saying I had a gift for making people feel seen. Her words stayed with me, a quiet echo of the person I was becoming, someone who could give what I'd once craved. I still thought about Margaret and Gregory, but not with the same ache. Their silence had been their choice, just as my distance was mine. I'd mailed Clara a thank you note for the journal, enclosing a poem I'd written about roots that grow through cracks in stone. She called me a week later, her voice crackling through the phone, saying she'd framed it. "You're blooming child," she said, and I smiled, picturing her garden, the bulbs we'd planted waiting for spring. Ethan sent a postcard, a simple thing with a lighthouse on it, no return address. He wrote that he was okay finding his footing and hoped I was too. I tucked it into my notebook, not as a promise to reconnect, but as a sign we were both moving forward, parallel, but apart. The hurt hadn't vanished, but it wasn't my center anymore. I was learning to hold it gently like a bruise that no longer throbbed with every touch. The biggest lesson came to me by the river one evening when the sky was streaked with pink. I'd spent so long believing family was something you were born into, something you had to earn. But it wasn't. Family was the people who saw you, who stayed, who chose you even when it was hard. It was Jasmine's laughter, Lila's drawings, Clara's faith. And it was me choosing myself, day after day, not because I was perfect, but because I was enough. The truth I'd fought for wasn't just about Eileen or the lies. It was about my right to exist, to take up space, to love, and be loved without apology. I stood brushing dirt from my jeans and walked home, the river's murmur fading behind me. The city felt alive, not overwhelming, but inviting, a place where I could keep growing. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would. But I had a life built from my own hands, and that was more than I'd ever dreamed. What truth have you had to fight for to claim as your own? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, to know what shaped you. If this journey resonated, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for listening, for being here with me. Here's to finding our light wherever it leads. Take care.